Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to bring you back after lunch. I know some of y'all might have had some party lunches. Try not to fall asleep. If you need to stand up, that's great. Just feel free to stand up, stand along the walls, whatever you need to do to stay awake. But I don't think you'll have a problem. It's going to be a very engaging session. So we are actually talking about partnership engagements. So this is like what successful partnerships between resource communities and our academic communities can look like. And we'll hear from different stages and different projects. So that's going to be exciting. And our amazing moderator for this session is Christine DeLong. So I'm going to hand it off to her and let her do her work.
All right. Thank you. So welcome to everyone here to LSU. Hopefully you had a really great lunch. Our first speaker is Sarah Franzen. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology and an affiliated faculty in African and African American Studies here at LSU. Her research broadly focuses on the diverse ways of knowing embedded in practices associated with farming and how these practices can be used to retain culture, foster environmental relations, build institutions, and create social change. Her research, Sarah uses film as a tool to better understand tactic, embodied, affective, and sensory aspects of these practices. So, have a talk title? Or just
It's on my, there you go.
So Sarah's talk will be starting with community engagement perspectives on a new project. All yours.
Just, yes.
Okay. All right. I try to keep track of my own time. All right, I'm supposed to keep talking to this. And we're doing 10 minutes again, Emma? Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. I have to admit, when Rachel first said, do you want to come talk? I said, well, I haven't started my project yet, so what am I going to talk about? My CASC project is actually starting in January, so I have very little to report. And she kept saying, oh no, you surely can talk about something, or at least how you got to this project. So after her coaxing, I said, okay, I'll talk how I started the project. So this is just the beginning. I don't know yet whether this will turn out well or not. Ask me in another 2 or 3 years. I'll tell you what works and what didn't when we get there. But to give you a little perspective of how I got to starting the CASC project, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Let's see. There we go. With what I was doing before I started the CASC project and some of the lessons I learned from trying to do community engaged research previously. So for my previous research, I worked with an organization called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. It is a large network of Black farm and craft and credit union cooperatives throughout the southeastern United States. And as mentioned in my bio, I worked with them through making film projects. A lot of what I wanted to understand was how the use of collectives, or even more specifically cooperatives, helped change some of their material conditions and some of their informational exchanges and some of their social and cultural aspects. So I came to research this and looked at things like this. This is a vegetable processing plant set up by one of the cooperatives. I filmed their work, talked to them, talked about how they got it established, what it did for the farmers, followed on practices like this that are moments of exchanging information, educational events, farmer to farmer trainings, trying to capture a lot of information about what cooperatives do. Now, when I did this research, my whole goal was to do this in a community engaged process. I met with everybody before I started the research. I told them what I wanted my research to be. I asked them to be partners in my research. I listened to what they had to say about what they thought was the most interesting things to film, pay attention to, take note of. So all these are all stills from films. All the things I filmed are things that participants said, this is what's important, we should film this is how we should film it, and so on. I spent a lot of time also talking about myself and my goals and how I wanted to give back to the organization in the end. This was something that was important to me, that this wasn't just research for research's sake, but that I could do something for the organization and make things available. But that became kind of a question too. This was my dissertation research, by the way. So I also had the pressure of a committee telling me to write a dissertation. So sometimes I would bring back, chapters or articles or things, but I also, that's this, had my films. So this is me screening a film. I had my films to show. So I'd screen films, hand out DVDs, and try to use the information that way to give back. As I got more into it, I also created, this is a screenshot from, I'm creating an interactive gallery of my films. And this is a set of stories that I set up where you can choose from the different land tours I did with different participants. So I kept trying to find different ways to give back. But I have to admit, it was never completely the most satisfactory way of doing things because my questions were always pre-formed. What I wanted to know came out of doing graduate studies, sitting in classrooms, reading a bunch of stuff and saying, I have these questions and I'm going to go with this organization and see what I can find out. And so even though my goal was to give back and I keep trying to give back, I never knew how useful this really was. Did this really serve the community? So when this CASC opportunity came out, a colleague, I think it was Christine, sent me the email and said, hey, you're a junior colleague. This is a good opportunity. Why don't you think about applying? I was like, I don't have any project started. What do I know? What can I do? And I read through some of the RFP and some of the themes that were important. One of the leaders in the organization, so this federation has different state organizations as well. This is the guy who runs the Mississippi one. It's called the Mississippi Association of Cooperatives. It's not really important anyway. His name is Mr. Ben Burkett. He's a real strong leader in this network that I work with and has become one of my mentors and guides. And he was in New Orleans. New Orleans. Sorry, I'm a northerner. For the day when we were having coffee and hanging out and said, there's this grant that came up and being encouraged to apply. Now there still are academic pressures. I'm in a tenure track job. I probably should get grants. I should probably write reports. But I didn't know, I wanted to do something that could finally really give back. So I brought this up to him and I told him the things. And he said, this is perfect. I have this problem that we need to solve. Now, Mr. Burkett works with the Mississippi organization, but previously, this is a group in Louisiana. The Louisiana farmers used to have a Louisiana State Association. It kind of fell apart for various reasons. The stories of how these things build and fall is what I did my dissertation research on, but not important at this moment. But anyway, so he's been meeting with groups of farmers from Louisiana, both him and his daughter. And they've really been trying to figure out how to get the Louisiana farmers more collected and more networked back together. And he said, one of the things when we go to visit these Louisiana farmers that they keep bringing up is that things are changing. They can't do things the same way. Now, this network of farmers is all small holding farmers. And by that, I mean, sometimes some have like 5 acres, but on the average around 40 acres, usually under 100, they're small farmers. Irrigation is minimal. A lot of it is based on rain-fed, using rain and rain processes and other minimal techniques. I mean, here they're looking at some different machinery, but these are usually bought by a cooperative, which is why the cooperative is important. And he's kind of talking about what you can do when you get the cooperative and can buy some equipment. So he said the Louisiana farmers are really starting to notice things. They're starting to notice that planting is happening at a different time and that harvesting is happening at a different time. And this is affecting everything like contracts, when you can go to the farmers markets, and the volatility of rain is really affecting farmers who don't use irrigation on a regular basis. And all of these weather events are changing how these farmers are responding to farming. It would be really great if we can start talking to them and figure out some way of getting to understand what their problems are a little better. And I thought this was a great idea. And I started talking to him more and I came back and sort of read through the RFP a little bit more. And from this is really where and how the project built up. And I have no idea where I am on time anymore. Being close, but we'll just go on for a few more minutes. I got 3 minutes. So from this point, this is how we kind of initiated the project. It started with talking to him. I met with some of my other colleagues. Joe Tranier was here in the audience as well. who came and talked to me a little bit about, well, what does this mean from a climate side? Would this be interested? Talked to some people in the Ag Center about agricultural extensionists. What do they do about this? Came back, talked to the farmers again and said, okay, here's what everyone's thinking. What do you think? How can this information be useful? And worked with the farmers themselves to design the plan. So our from the point of our first letter of intent, all the way through the final grant, each stage, how it was designed, what questions are being asked, what should be the outputs even, and how the outputs should look, have been informed by, I've consulted with other people, but then it's always come initiated with and always came back to the farmer organizations to say, is this what is going to be useful? Is it going to work for you? Now, is this going to work? And is this going to be used for them? I have no idea. That's why it's called starting a project. And that's why I wasn't really sure if I would have much to add. But this is just my telling a little bit of how I got from trying to do a community engaged project to thinking about how the initiation and the start of it is actually a really important part to start the community engagement. And that doing this has changed how I even started to frame the questions and think about my outputs ahead of time. And I'm hoping that this creates something that is actually much more tangibly applicable. Thank you.
It's a question and answer at the end, right?
Yeah, it's okay.
I will present our next speaker. It is Barney Austin, who will be, his title is Strengthening Work Products Through Collaboration in Oklahoma. So Barney Austin has 30 years of experience in water resource science, engineering, and planning. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Agricultural Engineering in Canada in 1989, and his PhD in Civil Engineering in England in 1995. The following years of public and private sectors, Dr. Austin is now the president and CEO of Aqua Strategies Incorporated, a company that specializes in helping clients understand and manage their water resources. Aqua Strategies has clients all over Texas and Oklahoma, as well as overseas, and enjoys working with the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations the most.
Thank you. All right, so I gather from some of the other presentations that there may be some formatting issues that come up through my presentation, but hopefully we'll be able to see all I wanted to include on these slides. So this, unlike Sarah's presentation, I'm at the tail end of this project, and we've done most of the good work, and this presentation is really about the successes involved in that project, not so much on the cool results, but on the cool collaboration that was involved in this project. And you know, I wanted to, before I start with my slides and get into the modeling work and the collaboration, this is actually the second of two projects that were very similar. We first did a project looking at the impacts of climate change on the Red River Basin, and worked collaboratively with folks at OU in those climate change model results downscaled and applied to the river basin. But the second one was interesting in that we proposed to collaborate closely with the Oklahoma Water Resources Board on this project. And for those of you that know the history of the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations and water resources management in Oklahoma, that's an interesting one, because there was a very contentious situation on the Kiamichi Basin and Sardis Lake over the last few years that resulted in a water settlement a few years ago. And the state of Oklahoma and the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations were on opposite sides of the table on that, in that, let's call it a discussion. It was really a lawsuit, but that discussion. So there's been a little bit of tension between those parties since. So working collaboratively with OWRB on this was an interesting idea. And as you'll see, it was successful. So in the past, historically, before the lawsuit over Lake Sardis, The Choctaw and Chickasaw nations were minimally involved in water resources planning across their region. And there's a number of reasons for that, but a big part of that is that they were treated just as a stakeholder, just like anyone else in those water resources discussion across the region. They, they wanted a government to government relationship on those discussions, and they were offered the role as a stakeholder, just like anyone else in those discussions. So they decided not to participate a lot of the time. The Oklahoma Water Resources Board makes decisions at water rights in the state and still do. But as a result of this water settlement, which I was fortunate enough to be involved in, the tribes now have a seat at the table at the front end of those discussions about new water right applications that meet a certain threshold or a certain criteria. And furthermore, requires the use of an adequate hydrologic model. And I would never have used that terminology myself. I'd want to have something like a really, really good hydrologic model or the best hydrologic model. That, when lawyers get involved, there's a reason why they chose that terminology. It helped, working together with this project, helped bring those two parties together to work together on the development of the model. And that's what I'm going to talk about here real quick. So the objectives of the project are similar to the Red River project for the Canadian River Basin. We took some climate change projections, downscaled those results, applied them to a big model, which is a grid-based rainfall runoff model, applied them to a riverware model, which is a model that we built to do water rights accounting and analysis of water availability, to look at ultimately how much water is available to individual water right holders in various places in the basin under the current condition and the future condition. I gotta remember not to point this over here, but to point it over this one. The Red River Basin, I know I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm gonna run through some of these real quick. But the Canadian River Basin is right here. We didn't do the entire basin. The area of interest really was this part of the basin here. The Canadian Basin, of course, extends all the way into Colorado. For some parts of the project, we had to see and analyze what was going on the rest of the basin from a rainfall and runoff perspective. But for water accounting and for determination of water availability, we're really focused on the area that the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations are particularly interested in. And so we ended up, like with the Red River model, choosing a number of different climate models and downscaling those in a number of different RCPs and using those so we could get a range of possibilities out into the future and compare those to sort of a baseline condition. What do we have right now in terms of water availability across the area? We then applied that to a big model so that we could understand what's going on with rainfall runoff, again, in the current condition and the future condition. And the output from the big model was the input to the riverware model. So we end up with an awful lot of data, and you guys are used to playing with a lot of data. And, making sense of that data was a big part of this project, and how to use that data to make informed decisions about water availability. And ultimately, Ethan was talking before, but ultimately it's going to be the kind of information that Ethan brings to communities to talk to them about water availability and infrastructure and demand growth and all those kinds of things. The riverware model is reasonably complex, but let me tell you a little bit about water rights administration in Oklahoma. Take a step back here real quick. So believe it or not, the state makes decisions about water right applications based on the average annual flow in the river. So it doesn't matter how much variability there is in that flow. If the average annual flow, once you've subtracted existing water rights and the domestic use set aside, things like that, I'm simplifying just a little bit. But ultimately, they make a decision about whether someone can get a water right based on the average annual flow, which to me is crazy. No other Western state in the nation does it that way, right? Because it's important to know how much water is in the river during drought conditions or extreme drought conditions. Fish doesn't care how much water is in the river on average, right? They need water in the river all the time in order to survive, but it's the same for the community and public water suppliers. But it is what it is. And So we needed to have more information to bring to those communities. So we developed this riverware model. And we're developing stream flow from the big model. We're looking at migration, conveyance losses, water level fluctuations in lakes and reservoirs. We can run it on a daily time step. So it's once it's built, a really, really complex model, but it has all kinds of opportunities and applications. We can run all kinds of different scenarios, including climate change scenarios. But involving OWRB, I was a little apprehensive at first. But at the beginning of the project, I was thinking, well, it's all right for them to be involved because a lot of the data that we need for the model we can get from them. So we can just ask them to provide that data, and that'll save us some time. But ultimately, that collaboration is extremely useful. They helped us with the technical methodology. They helped develop the model, review the draft results, and helped with the reporting parts of that. And I asked a colleague of mine, the guy who did most of the modeling work, I said, can you list out all the things that OWRB contributed on this project? And I have the slide to talk through, but in the end, we had he gave me 6 slides of things that OWRB helped us with. And in the end, they didn't help us actually build the model. They weren't writing code, but they were providing lots of input on assumptions, providing lots of data sets that we didn't know about, helping us develop that methodology, which ultimately is super important, right? Because we want them to use the model with us, with the tribes, in order to make decisions about water right applications in the future. And unless they're involved in developing the model with the tribes, they likely wouldn't be very happy about using that model in those decisions. So I'm going to skip through these slides really quickly because, like I said, there's 6 of them where they provided some really significant input. Number 4, number 5, number 6, and all the way through to demand scenario. What scenarios do we want to run with the model? So really the overall purpose was to determine impacts of climate change, but there really was an ulterior motive here that we were able to capture very effectively with this project, and that is collaboration with OWRB for those future decisions that will be made under the water settlement in Oklahoma. So despite my apprehension, I think it was an extremely good project. And actually, we're talking with 2 things real quick. We're talking with OWRB about going back to the Red River model and talking them through it, talking to them about what we did on that model and potentially making some adjustments to that or changing the assumptions in order to get the results that they want, but also give them some comfort that that's the right model to use. That's the adequate hydrologic model to use for those decisions in that basin. The other thing is that the Choctaws were successful in getting funding from another source to conduct training workshops on the riverware model that OWRB attended, the Choctaw Nation attended, the Chickasaw Nation attended, and actually the Kaw Nation attended too. We opened it up and they decided to participate in that. So the state, I think, is gradually coming around to the idea that they need something better than average annual flows to make those decisions, and they may end up adopting riverware statewide for those discussions in the future, in large part because of this project. I'm out of time, right? So let me do this real quick. Yeah, those are the model results. We're going to wrap up in September next year. We had a couple of amendments on the project, and I think I talked through those ones already. So thank you.
Our next speaker is Julie Lively. Her presentation title is Louisiana Fisheries Forward, a program for commercial seafood community. Dr. Julie Lively is the Louisiana Sea Grant College Program's Executive Director and Associate Professor here at LSU Ag Center. Her work centers around commercial fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. Her applied research focuses on blue crab and shrimp, including soft shell crab production, bait and disease work with blue crabs and derelict crab traps and ghost fishing, and post-harvest processes in the shrimp industry. In addition to extension and outreach on these topics, she has also worked on characterizing the freshwater commercial fishery in the Louisiana Fisheries Forward program to improve economic success in commercial fisheries. She is the editor of the monthly fisheries newsletter, Land Gap. Previously, she worked with the horseshoe crab, whelk, and gill fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic. She received her BS in biology from Truman State University and PhD in marine biology at the University of Delaware.
Thank you. So I knew it was after lunch, so I tried to go with lots of pictures. Super smart. Already learning being that way. So first, just a little bit, because I assume not everyone, since only 50% of the states in this program actually have a Sea Grant program. So Sea Grant, we are Louisiana Sea Grant, we are housed within LSU, but we are part of, there are 34 programs across the country. 34th is now Guam, which isn't in this picture yet. They're working on updating it. We have over a 50-year history here in Louisiana working with coastal communities. And it's those partnerships that we're able to build on. So Louisiana Sea Grant, we have our research program that actually has research of our own, but we also fund research, both from the national office, on kind of larger scale things, and then we also get funding from the federal government to hand out for Louisiana problems. Our outreach program, our marine extension program, is one of our largest areas where we have our specialists, which are faculty here on campus, and we have about 8 or 9 agents who are out in the field working in the communities. It's based off the cooperative extension models. They're actually in the Ag Center cooperative extension offices. Our law and policy program, which is able to advise or translate all the laws, because many of us are scientists and not lawyers, but they are incredibly important when it comes to coastal issues. Our education program and our communication program. And that kind of factors into the program that I'm going to talk about today. But to set the stage, if you're not familiar, Louisiana is the largest fishery in the lower 48 states. We usually have, these are 2019 numbers, but that was one of the last more normal years, so I left them. Between pandemics and hurricanes, we usually often have over 1 billion pounds of seafood landed in the state. And it's often, we have around 12,000 commercial fishermen. However, this applies to all of our industries, but especially our shrimp industry has been in significant decline for the last several decades. And I will say that this has definitely, we've done this originally back with increasing fuel prices, decreasing dock prices, imports significantly on the rise. These were the major problems in the 80s and 90s for the industry. However, in the last couple of years, it has really intensified again. As our economist just pointed out in another meeting last week, shrimp is one of the only commodities that has not seen any inflation. They are actually seeing a decrease in price, even though I think all of us can understand if you go to the store, everything else is increasing. Yeah, we're seeing some of the largest dip in prices that we've seen since the 80s and 90s in the shrimp fleet. Actually, right now should be one of the largest times of year for shrimping, and the majority of the Gulf fleet is tied up. They're not even going out. We also have great things. So one of the reasons I wanted to pick this project is it works so much with our coastal communities and with the seafood industry. And that industry is right on the front of changes in climate. So this is specifically Hurricane Ida. However, we had Laura, Delta, Zeta, and Ida that hit in 366 days. And basically every inch of our commercial fishing coastline was heavily impacted and is still heavily impacted in most of these areas. So while they were already facing all these other pressures, even, we can always find the one that they will put on the news, but most of our commercial fishermen will talk to us that they see things are changing. They know things are changing, and they recognize the storms are getting worse. They're coming faster. We're seeing increased precipitation. So this started back in 2013, but we've seen the need, and we actually were just earlier today signing the contracts for next year for the Louisiana Fisheries Forward program. So this was a partnership. We have a lot of partnerships with our DNR, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. But this was a specific one. They saw a need to help advance and kind of professionalize the commercial industry. Our commercial fishing industry, many of the licenses, basically a couple $100, you can be a commercial fisherman. So they would often get a lot of people jumping in and out depending on the economy. If construction went down, or a huge oil and gas economy, if oil and gas had a lot of layoffs, commercial fishing licenses would jump. And while some were doing it the right way, they often saw a lot that weren't doing it the right way. So the state saw this need, but they also recognized that they didn't really have the resources and they definitely didn't have the relationship with the community. So it's kind of based on the 3 stools of outreach. So that's where the state saw the need. They wanted to make sure that all the fishermen knew the compliance issues going on, that when there were rule changes, it was getting out to the fishermen, and rapid response when they had a specific problem. We also saw a need for extension and research. There was a lot of research being done that was applicable to the industry, and we wanted to be able to get it out to them. I'll go into some of that a little bit more. But a lot of it was us recognizing, or our agents recognizing, what the industry needed. I think Sarah said it great when she heard, like, I have a problem. That's something that we often hear from kind of both of our partners on this, the state as well as the fishing industry, that there is a problem they recognize and they're looking for a way to fix it. So one of the big things we do are summits, doc days, and workshops. A lot of our workshops are very specific to a single focus. It may be business planning, it may be disaster response, but it could also just be species specific. It's for the shrimp industry to give them updates. When our crab industry was having a lot, we still do those almost once a year. One of the big overarching things we do is the summit, which is traditionally every 2 years. Pandemics and hurricanes have prevented that, and we'll hopefully be back in March of next year. And we usually get 300 to 500 fishermen coming to the Pontchartrain Center near New Orleans and learning. And you know, most of these tables, there are some vendors, but we tell the vendors they can't just be selling something. They have to have new technology. They need to have a hands-on demonstration. It's also scientists. It's also a lot of the managers that can be there and they can talk across the table as to why the policy isn't working, why they see the need for some sort of change. Several years ago, at one of our first summits, there was a lot of discrepancy in how oysters were measuring, because while we may want to use, you know, they had bushels and some had baskets and some had half a basket, and they were trying to legally define what half a basket was. And so the fishing industry was able to talk to the managers and to talk to within the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, as well as health and hospitals. It is producing a lot of fact sheets, but then it's working with the agents and working with our comms team to give things in a way that the fishermen can understand it. Often we will run things by some of our fishing industry partners so they can tell us if you still have too much jargon in that or it just really doesn't make sense. We house everything within a website, and one of the things the state asked for at the very beginning was a video series, and they wanted a professional video series. And so we actually hired Construct Films, which now we can't even afford because they're doing things at Sundance and many other film festivals. But they were able to go out and get great footage for us on what the commercial fishing industry is and what they do and what is needed. So here they are just out actually doing some of the filming. These are great resources. I often send them, if you just want to learn what a specific fishery is kind of about, what they're doing, some of the rules and regulations, it really gives you that full summary. Each one is about 30 minutes. And it is how to be a crab fisherman, how to be a finfish fisherman, how to be a shrimp fisherman. And it also just gives a lot of details and on the water footage. And as you see, they're working with actual fishermen. So we were able to actually work with the industry on all of these. So here's kind of a full list that we have. They're all on the website. And you know, some of them, but then we also work with the state to update when they make changes for us. However, as times changed, the state did not have the same funding available. And so we've actually moved now to using whiteboard videos for the most part, because they're relatively inexpensive and you can often show relatively complex things pretty easily, or things that are just really hard to get good visuals of. And we found that the industry really likes these. It gives them really good visuals to actually use and to understand what some of the problems are. We were able to do this with the crab industry. The crab industry was suddenly asking for a limit to entry. They found that there were just too many people jumping into the industry. Crab trap theft was significantly on the rise, because if you just borrow a few traps from a lot of people, then you know becoming a fisherman is really inexpensive. So they wanted to see some sort of program. We were working on LFF at the exact same time. And so the state was able to combine these into one. So we helped develop all of the materials, and then the state runs it. And then the oyster industry liked it so much that now to renew your oyster license, you have to just go through the educational pieces of the program. And the other piece that came out of this is research needs. So throughout this project, while it's not specifically a research grant or research contract, we've identified problems in the industry that they've asked for or that the state has asked for. So shrimp turns black when it's exposed to air. It's not hazardous, it's just oxidation, but people don't like it. There were new products available, but they hadn't been tested in Louisiana. We were able to test some of those things. We wanted to work more with the commercial fishing industry, the freshwater sector. No one knew what they were doing or who they were. They were very hidden up in northern Louisiana. We were able to do some human dimensions work, alligator handling. There was some issue in meat quality, and we were able to identify where that problem was handling. Or even the state had asked for, with the black drum fishery, there were a lot of questions in management, and they wanted to know what the bycatch was coming in. So we were able to roll that into this program, bring in outside researchers where we needed, to be able to address these and actually do research projects within the larger program. So this is the current website. So it's one of those that we'd be able to work back and forth with kind of both. We consider really both the fishing industry stakeholders as well as the state to be kind of our partners on it. And so we really kind of learn from both to work back and forth with them.
So 5 minutes speakers lined up. We'll take some questions and get you some answers here this afternoon. So I see everyone's still awake. I don't see anybody asleep. That's good. Yes. Oh, okay.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the Zoom chat. The first is a kind of a multi-part question for Barney from Sharon Hausum. The first part, can you say more about how you define collaboration for this project between the tribes and the state? And then you want the second part now or wait?
I'm never going to remember the first part if you tell me the second part. So let me start there. So yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure collaboration among social scientists at least has all kinds of different definitions. And in my mind, it's a fairly narrow definition that we are working with a key stakeholder on this particular project to identify and achieve a common goal, which was to develop this adequate hydrologic model. And although this is a climate science center project, and you know, we were really, as scientists on the project, we're really interested in the impacts of climate change on the Canadian River. Like I said, one of the ulterior motives was this collaboration, to be able to work with a stakeholder, to be able to use the results in the future in this collaborative manner.
Right, and the second question, hopefully I don't get feedback here. What were the biggest obstacles to that collaboration and how were they overcome?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think early on, there was a little bit of trepidation on both sides about working together, right? And we're on opposite sides of the table in a lawsuit. And although we had a cordial relationship with all of the staff and scientists involved in the project, it was unclear to me how well that collaboration was going to work. And there was a little bit of mistrust, honestly, on both sides. And I think from the get-go, we were just super open and transparent about everything we were doing, and slowly through the project, getting that trust and, you know, listened to what those folks, everyone had to say, implemented those in the model, trained them on the use of the model so that they understood what was in the model and what wasn't in the model and assumptions. And at the end of the day, I think we ended up in a good place because of that transparency and that collaboration.
This is a question for Sarah from Mike Langston. Please tell us your top 3 tips or lessons learned for working with people, in your case, the farmers, who might come from very different backgrounds than yourself.
Tips. I do preface this with, I'm still learning, and ask me again in 2 years. I trying to do something different. I would say one of the first things that has really worked for me was and I have to preface this with saying I'm an anthropologist, so I work with scientists, but I come from a different disciplinary field. So one of the first steps for me is often gaining a kitchen table relationship where you become familiar enough with people, and that includes what I have found is allowing, just as you want to get to know other people and know what they want, allowing them to get to know you. So quite often I get interviewed, I get quizzed, I get asked a lot of, invasive questions, but then that's, often what news researchers do in return. I get watched when I'm around in the community and doing things. And so until there becomes sort of a reciprocal sort of relationship and trust. So having that sort of relationship really helped in my situation. The second thing that really helped in my situation was to bring products back repetitively, not just the outputs. So for me, filmmaking was one of my big tools. So always having screenings of non-finished projects, just like, here's some footage I shot. And, it wasn't beautiful or perfect, but, just so I'm constantly bringing back what I'm doing and reporting in where I am on things. Because things take a while to finish. First two, I don't know, I suppose, also, I guess the third one would be, and I think this is why I brought up that, there's, the pressures. I'm a junior faculty, I'm on the tenure track. Like there's the pressures that whatever fields or some of us work for different agencies or organizations, there's always those pressures, but they often come with different timelines and pressure structures than community-based organizations. So recognizing that difference of time and trying to make adjustments and compromises. I think that's kind of maybe the hardest one because, you do have your own pressures, but you want to respect that other people might work on it. Like right now, we're working on a collaborative paper and it still hasn't been submitted yet because it's taken a lot longer to do things collaboratively and write collaboratively with academics, but I find it important. So I'm dealing with a slower process.
Other questions?
Sorry, running. Like I need like slow music.
Hey, thank you. Dr. I have a question for Dr. Julie. You're talking about partnership engagement in the fisheries forward. In the 2019, return in Hayden was the third largest return. I was wondering, do you have partnership engagement with that entity as a fisheries group, and what is that engagement like? Because generally it's fairly closed off.
So it's a little bit mixed, but yes, we do. So there's really there's 3 menhaden players in the state. There's really 2. There's 2 large companies that are landing the majority of processed menhaden that goes into all the fish oils. There's one entity that is still doing bait menhaden, and we work quite a bit with them. So Omega out of Abbeville, our agent there has had a history with them. There's several buyouts. We were just actually down there for a marine extension meeting, and we were able to do a full tour. We take groups there all the time. They work with us quite a bit. The one that is more south of New Orleans has kind of changed over history. Most recently, we're working on getting back with our agent that's down there. They were bought out by a large company out of South Africa that just kind of immediately shut off everything. So we're working on building those relationships, but it's taking some time. But again, I think because we have some of those people that are part of the communities, they're living down there and working down there, their kids are going to school, their spouses may be teaching some of their kids. So we have found that we work quite a bit with the menhaden industry.
Other questions?
This is for Barney. I was wondering like how it is that the state of Oklahoma was making these water allocation decisions in the absence of the data that was provided by the tribal governments. if that was maybe like due to the status of water rights being like federally reserved water rights, so therefore they were kind of partitioned administratively in a different category, or how it was that they sort of ignored this data in the past.
Yeah, that's a good question. The surface water in Oklahoma, like all the western states, belongs to the state. So once that water falls on the ground, ends up in a stream, it belongs to the state, and you can apply to get a water right in order to divert that water and put it to beneficial use. That's how it works in Oklahoma. That's how it works elsewhere. Oklahoma is somewhat fortunate that there's a relative abundance of water, certainly in the eastern part of the state. And so we're not in a situation like New Mexico, for example, where some of those streams are over allocated. There's more water right holders and there's water available. So there, just to some extent, this is a for water availability analyses and water rights administration, it's a problem that's going to be a big one in the future, and it's not so much of a problem right now. But you know, making decisions about average annual flow is a major issue, and they haven't thought through some of the things that other states have had to think through, like New Mexico, basically all the other western states, on things like impact of granting water rights above reservoirs that are already fully allocated. So back to your question, though, about the involvement of the tribes, the state of Oklahoma has always said, you know, any water right application, you know, that has to be announced to the community, and you have an opportunity to protest that. But the tribes are not treated any differently than any other stakeholder. And the Choctaws and Chickasaws, I think, felt snubbed in that process. They wanted a government to government conversation about those water right decisions. And because they were treated just as a simple stakeholder, tended to not participate in that process. What brought it to a head was the Oklahoma City's application for water out of the Comanche Basin below Lake Sardis for 100,000, 48,000 acre feet per year, which is a huge chunk of water out of a river that already dries up periodically. Once every 3 years or so in the current condition, it dries up. And so that's why the federal lawsuit was filed, and that's why we had the water settlement. And the water settlement, I think, I mean, it only took 5 years, and for a federal lawsuit related to water involving tribes, that's like a blink of an eye. And I think that's because, first of all, the federal judge said, you guys can figure this out, so go talk to a mediator and get a solution. And we all sat down at the table together, went over the technical stuff, got the lawyers to agree on a solution that would protect the interests of the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, while providing Oklahoma City with water. Obviously not involved in that. But now moving forward with that part of the state, Choctaw Chickasaw Nation is occupied at least a quarter of the state of Oklahoma. Water rights decisions in those areas, once they meet a certain threshold, the tribes are automatic party to that decision-making process. And that's where this, you know, adequate hydrologic model, there's consideration of in-stream flows, which is not fully vetted in Oklahoma either. So we're Choctaw Chickasaw Nations, I think, are in a good place now with respect to water rights administration. Now the state needs to figure out what they're going to do in the rest of the state. Thank you.
Other questions? Who's gonna follow? Okay.
Yeah, I was also curious how these training sessions go, or these education programs for educating participants, tribal government members, educating them in the use of riverware or some of these pretty sophisticated models. How that's actually going to be carried out.
Yeah, so we've already done those trainings. There was a total of 6 full-day workshops. We did 4 of them up in Oklahoma, and we did 2 of them near my office in Austin, Texas. And I think the idea initially, at least from all of the participants, is they all wanted to learn how to use the riverware software and apply it themselves for future modeling and future scenarios, impacts of waterways, those kinds of things, and OWRB as well. OWRB were invited to those trainings, participated in those, I think we had 6 of 6 staff or so from OWRB, which was awesome. I think as we got to like workshop number 4 or so, I think there was a realization that maybe we're not going to be the experts on riverware, but it's good to know how the software works and to understand how, how to make those assumptions, how to develop those data sets, how the model runs, and what kinds of things you can do with the software. So I think at the end of the day, like I said, at the end of the 6th workshop, I think everyone was really happy that they could understand more or less how the software works, but are not going to be individual practitioners, individual users of those models themselves.
I'm going to run to online real quick and then I'll come back to the room.
Another Zoom chat question, this time for Julie. This is from Mike Langston of USGS. So one of your early slides, you listed extension, outreach, and another activity, maybe education. Can you explain the difference between those and why it's important to differentiate them?
Yeah, so for the most part, I would say within Secret, we do not really differentiate between extension and outreach. I mean, to some extent, extending is often kind of as more one way of, whatever information you have and getting it back out. So I've heard some of that, but we also often do see it as a two-way street. That we're also, getting the problems from the community and bringing those back to look for answers. For us, education is more of that formal or informal learning. We're around environmental literacy. Again, if you're with any audience, I guess now, key K to gray is the new approved NOAA phrase. I'm just learning some of these that they kind of just had a large meeting and changed some of their preferred terminology. But yeah, so for us, we don't really differentiate between extension and outreach, but I think that is, for us, it's important to keep it as a two-way street, whereas I think sometimes extension is only seen as from the universities to.
Do you have another question? If not, I'll ask the question. Or any of that question?
I have a question for Julie. So from Maryland, they have a very heavily regulated blue crab industry, commercial and recreational. And I'm curious if the commercial guys that you guys interact with are receptive to more regulation, or is the population blue crab down here so abundant that they don't need it? And is there risk of that potential blue crab population diminishing as the process changes?
Sure. So something that was interesting is when I got to around 2010, they were trying to get Marine Stewardship Council certification, one of the sustainability certifications for the blue crab industry. And they were able to push it, but as part of that, they wanted to see some most it was word changes to kind of meet the sustainability language, but it didn't change anything on the street. And they wanted the certification, but they did not want regulation changes, even if it was just in terminology. There was then kind of a changeover of our task force, and suddenly that group really didn't care about sustainability certification anymore, but they were happy to change the regulations. And I will say, so for the most part, blue crab is incredibly plentiful. Down here, it's a 1-year crop as opposed to like a 1 or 2-year crop up in Maryland. So we've never had those population issues at the same level. They did hit some overfishing status in, I think, like 13 and 14. And so they did put some more regulations in place. And some of that was like the limited entry. They at least wanted, so Louisiana is a right to work state, so the state will really never close license sales. So they at least put a hurdle that people had to go through the professionalism program, and that was asked for by the industry. So for the most part, the industry is actually pretty receptive to, they've changed escape ring size in recent years, the number of escape rings. They changed that you cannot, the legal size limit is at the 50% maturity line. So female blue crabs can only reproduce once when they go from immature to mature. So they changed it to any immature crab, female crab, you can no longer keep because they wanted to give those females a chance to reproduce. So yeah, the industry here has been pretty receptive, but as a whole, it's still, I mean, the vast majority, just in Maryland, you see that crab as we were taking photos of like every box we could behind all of the seafood restaurants instead of Louisiana.
Any other questions? I'll ask. This is for you. So I know as climate scientists, we can be seen as climate activists. I think we have to put out this morning, like emergency. And I know with the Sea Grant takes a different view on that. You're not supposed to be activists. You're there to provide the information. So I was going to ask you if you could kind of share that perspective of how you work with your stakeholders and not come across as an activist, but still promoting the science.
Sure. So that's, and actually this gets back to the mandate, I think, a little bit. So CEDAR, because we get federal funding, we cannot advocate for things. We cannot be lobbyists for anything. And so CEDAR has a long history, which allows us, especially if you're from this area, you know the mandate industry has been doing a lot lately. They know that we're not having any one agenda that we're pushing with climate. So one of the things when I first got here, and now it has changed a little bit. When I first got to the state back in 2010, because climate change had become so political, we would talk about sea level rise. We would talk about, you know, the actual things that were changing, and the industry had no problem with that. But we learned that if we said climate change, it was something too political. And that has, we still feel a little bit of that, but when we just talk about like, are things changing, they all say yes. Do we need to address that? Do we need to increase resiliency? So for us, it's word change. You know, just recently somebody mentioned about like doing adaptations, and we've learned the oyster industry, because if you're familiar with Louisiana, they're looking at putting in a very large sediment diversion that would change all the salinity. Adaptation has been used in that conversation a lot, and suddenly we learned adaptation is a political word. It is very charged. Now with other industries, they're happy to talk about adaptation. So yeah, it's kind of being sensitive, trying to learn some of those things. What has become political.
So Sarah and Barney, anything you want to add to that conversation?
So yeah, I worked a lot in Oklahoma, I worked a lot in Texas. I worked for the state of Texas before I went out on my own as a consultant. But back in the day, not too long ago, when I was working for the state, even the term climate change was banned. Very said, "You do not use that word." And so I was in charge of writing a chapter on surface water for the state water plan. But I also was ostensibly supposed to write a chapter on climate change, which, you know, made it difficult if you're going to write a chapter on that and not be able to mention that word. I couldn't just put XXXX, you know, across that. So we talked about it in terms of uncertainty. So we just said, you know, hey, there's a certain uncertainty associated with water supply in the future, and totally avoided that. And we accomplished all the same things, right? But we use that term uncertainty. And, you know, more recently, I think in the Oklahoma projects there, we have been talking about crowd and the possibility of drought in the future, and the possibility of drought being worse in the future than what we've seen in the past, which effectively you're saying the same thing as, you know, uncertainty or climate change in that particular context. But that's a much easier conversation to have with these rural water suppliers. You know, they've experienced the drought, and they could probably imagine a drought worse than what they've seen in the past. But telling them, hey, climate change is here, it's going to affect you. You'll get some people that'll just zone out and won't talk to you. So I think you can accomplish one of the same things that you're doing and address some of the same issues you have to deal with. Just be a little bit cognizant on the vocabulary that you use and the way you go about talking about it.
I'll add something from a slightly different perspective, because quite honestly, as a faculty, as an anthropologist, I don't think anyone cares if I say climate change. I don't know. Seriously, anyway, study people. But working with people in the field is kind of interesting, thinking about how you share your information back out. When I was in the field doing my first project, there was a group who was studying climate change who came. So I was in the field and watched this research project come and go. And I attended at a university some of their presentations about the climate models. That was super interesting. I learned all this stuff about changing, Alabama's changing landscape and temperature shifts and greenhouse gases and sorry, I'm not a scientist, but really cool information, and I took notes. Then I was in the field talking to the farmers about their experience, because they also tried to, and this is why I'm thinking about how do you prepare outputs, because they similarly tried to, have the sheets and the flyers and the reports and the presentations. But when I interviewed people, and I even have a little film online about somebody talking about this, they were like, I don't know, they just didn't ask about, the wasp nest and the bees, because the bees are a thing. I don't know if you don't want to observing bees is the thing about climate change. That's what they kind of summarized from this climate scientists. They want to know about wasp nests and bees. And that was about it. So thinking about how do you talk, now I don't know politically, I haven't done a deep investigation as the political field in different rural areas. So I don't really know, but when talking to the farmers about what does matter to you, it was, well, these things got to what you're saying. What can we observe? We observe very real things, and they really affect us. So I think whether it's the term climate change or not, creating the applicable outputs has to address those very real observable things.
Other question? Anything online?
Go ahead.
Okay.
For Sarah. I know that the project is still in progress, but what sorts of things do you anticipate in terms of giving back to the community? They discussed their concerns, the variability, in terms of when they can plant, harvest, take things to market, that sort of thing. So I guess, what do you anticipate? What do they anticipate going forward?
So how we talked about it was in sort of different avenues. One was to open up communication in a way. So this project is designed to start with the farmers, and take their information using ecological qualitative skills, going with my partners and climatologists and extension agents, and then bringing that back and doing focus groups about that information together. So that one is really, since we are LSU Land Grant University, thinking about how the things that are being done regularly anyway can come in avenues that make sense. So not having a predetermined idea, but gathering enough information together that we can sit together and show this in different ways and ask, how would you like to know this? Here are the problems. Here's what the climatologists have to say about it. Here's what the extension agents have to say about it. How does that work? What would be useful? So actually just coming with a bunch of stuff and asking that question in a focus group. So that's kind of the plan, not predetermining it. Although we do predetermine it a little bit. And so the extension agents especially have been thinking, one of the problems is always coming out with best practices. And we got to stop with this best practices because it's so variable, and especially for smallholder farmers. So instead, how can we think about menus? So we're thinking about infographic type of menus, where if this applies to you, here's somebody you can contact. Here's some resources. Here's maybe, an EQIP grant, or there's a lot of USDA, United States Department of Agriculture grants that are available, but they're all in these different categories, and which one might apply and which one might be available. But having this in a infographic type way that's more like a menu that's easy to identify with phone numbers, people to call. So this is some of our brainstorming, thinking about websites, which previously the internet divide was strong enough in rural areas that I've always been a little hesitant about that, but it's closing down. And as people are doing more and more on the phone, the internet's becoming more and more a possibility of outreach. And so what would a website look like? How would that be easy to read on a phone? So these are the things we're brainstorming, but we don't want to lock in until we have that final meeting. And then also some of the things that have come up is how far, what kind of climate information do you want to know? Do you want to know what predictions and models are available for a year from now, 5 years from now? what is the most useful? What helps you plan and in what ways? And having those questions all in the open with what can be supplied by different expertise, and then see what comes out of it. That's what I would say. Ask me in 2 or 3 years. I'll tell you if this worked or not. We're all thinking very optimistically right now. But this could all go haywire, and it's, who knows?
Any last questions? If not, I'll ask. I don't know if it's a question or so much of a comment. So both Sarah and Julie, you guys have used video as part of your program. And I was also involved in one of my research programs in a documentary. I wasn't the person making it, but one of the things I kind of learned is if you ask people to talk on film or on video now, they kind of open up. And like the mistake we did on our project was we didn't talk to the local fishermen. They were very hurt by it. But I think, like in retrospect, I think asking people to be on film, and like everybody wants to be a YouTube star now, go viral. I'm wondering if you find that really starts to open doors. You have people talking.
I think it's a little bit of both, because I think many people are like, I don't want to be on camera, but then they will. So I will say, coming up at our next summit, again, things that it's been really hard to live in coastal Louisiana the last few years. And one of the things that a lot of our agents felt might be helpful, I mean, we were talking about kind of like this Snoopy, Lucy, and maybe dating myself too much, or some of you, but like the 5 cents self-help, and like how is secret, like we're not mental health specialists, but they talk about just being able to talk about the problems. And so we're hoping to set up a booth where fishermen can just come talk about what they see as their major problems. And we have some of our coastal anthropologists and coastal geographers, we're going to try and help them advise on that too, and also be able to use it in some way or capture it in some way. But yeah, we're hoping that just kind of helps them feel like someone's listening, which again, we're going to figure out what to do with it after the fact. But
yeah, I would agree that with all of that, it's both. And I was very open with everybody, we want to be filmed or not filmed, or how it went, because people have a lot of preferences around it. But yeah, when people were choosing to be on film, yes, I agree. It was similarly like a moment to explain and show something to another audience, whether it was, we didn't always know who would see all these films, but we knew the network, which is this regional network, people in the network would, like that's who's going to house the archives at the end of these films. And so if nothing else, they knew they were talking to maybe each other or their own organization at different levels. So that audience, awareness of an audience makes a difference.
Did you have anything, or have you used video?
It's hard to get engineers to look away from their shoes, let alone fit a camera. We really have much experience with video. What's that? Yeah. I mean, there are opportunities, and I'm kind of jealous of the other people that have spoken about their experiences working with farmers and working with fishermen and things like that. That'd be awesome. That's what's missing in my career right now.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for this session, right? So it's time for a break. We got 15 minutes. So thank you, everyone.